Hey up everyone. First, I want to give a big shout out to all the riders and pillions everywhere, whatever you ride. Together we make the world a more exciting place. We are universally bikers after all. Thanks for the support on the channel too, and to be clear, there are no sponsored posts on this channel, and if there ever are, they will be announced very clearly. The videos are just my opinions, nothing more and nothing less. So now, to today's topic. In general, motorcycles don't scare me at all. I've ridden some monstrously powerful and insane bikes over the years, but even I've scared myself at times. Some motorcycles have a tendency to do that more than others, and there are a few bikes that over the years have earned that title Widowmaker. Some deserve it more than others. This is my list of the 10 scariest, most lethal motorcycles I have encountered in my many years of riding. These stories are from my own experiences, and there are different reasons behind the unerring ability of these bikes to leave you terrified and speechless, wondering how you survived. It isn't always just brutal power that makes them scary. What I realised when I was compiling this list though, is that these are some of the most fantastic sounding bikes that have ever graced our roads. So I decided to leave some of the fantastic exhaust notes of the bikes in the video. Their sound often just adds to the reputation they have, although there are exceptions to this rule. You will notice a distinct lack of modern bikes in this list too. Most modern motorcycles are designed to make things easy for the rider. The bikes here are mostly from a golden era of the motorcycle industry, where an anything goes approach really tested the limits of bike and rider. It also led to some real breakthroughs in motorcycle design. This was an era when the only rider aids you had were brakes, clutch and throttle. They weren't controlled by computer systems meant to fool the rider into thinking they actually had the skills to ride them. These were motorcycles that took no prisoners, bikes that would bite at the slightest provocation. Some newer bikes may well be more powerful and faster, but I don't necessarily consider them scary or insane in the same way, and most would seem a little out of place here, I think. The chassis and handling of many of the motorcycles of this area was often an afterthought. Scaffolding bolted around a ballistic engine that was pushed to its absolute limit. These quirks meant the bikes were often flawed in different ways. Health and safety and environmental impact assessments hadn't been invented to limit the designs manufacturers were putting together. The only limit was how far they dared to push things. I will give an honorary mention here to the now legendary Yamaha RD350LC, and indeed all of the Yamaha RD range. They were fast and powerful compared to most bikes of the day. However, I haven't included any of them on this list because they didn't have the insane design flaws of these other bikes here. They were fantastic rideable, powerful and light bikes. They were great to ride compared to most of the motorcycles on this list. So, without further ado, here is my list of the top 10 most malignant and downright murderous motorcycles ever put into production. Number 1 on the list is the legendary Maico 700. This motorcycle was originally made in the mid-80s and then resurrected in 2009 until 2014. It's still made in very small numbers to this day, and variants of the engine still fill the leaderboards of sidecar cross championships across the globe. The original Maico 700 was a motorcycle that took no prisoners. It was, and still is, possibly the scariest two-stroke motorcycle ever built. It was built in very small numbers, and there were variants up to a massive 760cc. I can't comment on the later versions, but I imagine that they are just as hard to tame as the originals, just hopefully with better brakes and suspension now. The torque of this massive two-stroke single meant that however gentle your throttle hand was, it was almost impossible to control. The chassis wasn't the problem with this bike. The engine was just brutal. That engine was and still is used in sidecar cross racing, but even with a sidecar attached, it will tear your arms off given the slightest chance. The original bike weighed just 100 kilos and produced over 80 brake horsepower as standard. There have been very few bikes made over the years that can offer the sort of adrenaline rush you get from riding a Maico 700. I was lucky enough to ride one once, at a time when my tuned RD350LC was my everyday ride. I didn't ask to ride it again. Next, we have the ubiquitous Yamaha VMX1200. First released in 1985, the V4 1200cc V Max was designed to challenge Honda's VF1100 Magna in the all-new power cruiser category. It didn't just challenge it. The V Max swept the V65 Magna into the annals of history with a gentle pat on the head. Yamaha increased the power of the engine by enlarging the intake and exhaust valves, adding aggressive camshafts, lighter pistons and huge carburetors. They then added the fabled V-Boost system. This effectively supercharged each cylinder using a servo to allow the motor to draw extra fuel once it hit around 6,000 RPM. This took the engine's power up to a massive 145 horsepower, easily surpassing the 100 horsepower of the VF1100C. Even at the hefty weight of 274 kilos, it would propel you from a standstill to 60 miles an hour in just 3.3 seconds. 100 miles an hour came within about 5 seconds, and before you had time to realise it, you were up to a maximum speed of around 150 miles an hour. After the first year, most models across the globe were restricted to produce gradually less and less power. Some never even had the innovative V-Boost system at all. However, their die-hard fans worked various ways around these power restrictions. It was such a heavy bike with big, heavy cast wheels that getting it to change direction wasn't always easy. The standard braking system was wooden with almost no feel, and these two things led to lots of accidents. It became notorious as a motorcycle for the hooligans out there. The way it produced its power was addictive, with a huge onrush of both power and torque descending at 6,000 RPM and continuing until over 9,000 RPM. The only problem ever, really, was stopping it. Next, we have a monster of a two-stroke with a 3-cylinder air-cooled engine. This was always known as a frightening motorcycle back in the 70s. In 1971, when Kawasaki first built the H2, they didn't just tear up the rulebook, they burnt it to ashes. Their only focus was speed. It was the fastest production bike in the world at the time, producing over 75 horsepower, but it was a handful to ride. The frame flexed like a fishing rod and the brakes were inadequate at best and downright dangerous in the wet. These traits earned it its nickname the Widowmaker. It was the first bike to earn that title I know of, and it was well deserved. 75 horsepower might not seem much by the standards of today, but the 77 Newton meters of torque hit like a sledgehammer at 6,500 RPM. Later models after 1974 got reworked geometry and a longer swinging arm, which did make it a little more manageable, but it never handled well. Next, we have the legendary TL1000R, another motorcycle that earned the name Widowmaker. The TL1000R was an animal of a motorcycle. The TL1000S was already a handful of a bike, but the engine was reworked to make the most powerful V-twin engine of its day. It produced over 135 horsepower, and that brutal power could be snatchy at low revs, but it was smooth and usable once above 5,000 RPM. From that point, there was just a surge right the way up to 9,000 RPM and beyond, where this engine's incredible strength and power seemed to go on forever. It had an ultra-short wheelbase with very aggressive steering geometry. and this made it twitchy, and the rear suspension was questionable to say the least. The addition of a steering damper did improve the handling, but the chassis just wasn't up to the job of taming that incredible engine. Now, every list needs a good oddity, and this is the oddity in my list. Built in England, the Quasar was a feet-forward motorcycle, so the rider was sitting down inside it rather than sat on it. It had an all-round body shell that certainly looked different, but it always felt a little bit disconcerting. Its rider space offered some protection from the weather, but the low seating position did restrict vision, especially in traffic. Its low centre of gravity and hub centre steering gave it a lack of feel, which meant there was no warning when things started to let go. It was an ungainly bike to ride, with a huge turning circle, although it did have excellent aerodynamics because of the full fiberglass body. The bike came originally with a 750cc 4-cylinder Reliant car engine and could comfortably cruise at 100 miles an hour indefinitely. It would eventually reach a speed of about 110. They built the Quasar in Bristol, but due to a lack of funds, there were only about 6 bikes produced between 1976 and 1979. After that, various engines were tried, but the design just didn't resonate with either motorcycle riders or car drivers, so it just never sold. King of the 1980s race replicas, the 1986 RG500 Gamma was effectively a road-going version of the GP race bike used by Barry Sheehan, Tom Herron, Marco Lucinelli and Steve Parrish and many others. More powerful than the Yamaha RD350LC, it had a fantastic chassis and great brakes. So why was it so scary? For anyone who has ever ridden one, they will know. There was little power below 6,000 RPM, but the rev counter didn't even count below 3,000. Peak power came in at around 9,000 RPM, with a dip to 9,500, which, if you chose to and were fast enough, was the perfect time to change gear. If you didn't, when the revs hit about 9,600 RPM, you were instantly catapulted to over 12,000 RPM and past the supposed top speed of around 147 miles an hour. This second phase of the power band happened almost instantaneously and was the cause of many high-side crashes, on track and on the road. It was all but uncontrollable for the average rider, and even experienced racers found it difficult to handle. In 1971, Suzuki decided they wanted to build the most powerful motocross bike they could. The bike they built was the TM400 Cyclone. The frame was so light that it just couldn't handle the power, and even without the stresses of motocross, it was prone to flexing and bending. The engine was a monster, producing 40 horsepower, but it was pushed so far that it just never ran consistently. With such extreme tuning and a less than reliable ignition system, the power could come in anytime between 3,500 and 5,000 RPM. But when it did come in, you just had to hang on and hope. The later TS400 model was built significantly heavier, and the engine was detuned, but even this bike was a handful, so you can imagine what the earlier, lighter TM400 Cyclone was really like. Now this next one might not be a motorcycle you would expect to find here, but as I said, scary and insane come in many forms. At the time, the V-Rod was the most powerful Harley ever made, and the engine is, in all honesty, one of the best Harley, with the help of Porsche, have ever built. In many ways, it's a great bike, but it has one serious flaw. The V-Rod is built low, and so the lean angle was always going to be limited, but 30 degrees makes getting around even gentle corners a nightmare. However, it doesn't stop there. There is a wide cantilevered section just in front of the rear tyre. When leaned over in a turn, unfortunately, if you hit a bump and compress the rear suspension, the subframe can lift the rear tyre off the tarmac with a big jolt, which can quickly send you sliding across the road on your arse with no apology. That one design flaw puts it in this list. Now with this next one, I'm cheating, I know, but this is a special case. In the mid-80s, the big four Japanese companies had discovered the turbocharger and were determined to make them work on motorcycles. Kawasaki built the GP-Z750 Turbo, Suzuki the XN85, Honda the CX500 Turbo, and Yamaha the XJ650 Turbo. Suzuki was still suffering the losses made by the RE5 rotary engine bike at this point, so the XN85 was probably the least well funded of these bikes, but they were all just bad. They all had plenty of power, but it made the bikes very heavy, and the turbocharger technology just wasn't well developed at that point. It didn't suit motorcycles in the same way it suited big diesel engines either. All the bikes produced had flaws, and keeping the high temperature of the turbo down and away from any tender fleshy areas was a difficult task. Imagine putting a Formula 1 engine in a Hippo and you will have some idea about how these motorcycles rode. It could get very painful very quickly. Last mention on this list here is another special mention, and sorry Suzuki, you do seem to have made the list more than any other manufacturer, but I had to include the Suzuki X7. It was the 250 built to take on Yamaha's fabled RD350. It was cheap, fast and light, and just a little temperamental. It had a tendency to shake its head and push the front wheel into the air at the slightest touch of the throttle. It was hardly the best motorcycle for learners. However, 1970s learner rider regulations said that anything up to 250cc was fine, so every young rider wanted one of these cheaper versions of the RD350. If they couldn't afford an X7, there was no need to worry. Suzuki made an even smaller and lighter 200cc version called the X5 that was even cheaper. The performance of the X5 in the real world meant it could often keep up with the 250s, but being lighter, it was even more prone to the same handling issues the X7 had. Many young riders found themselves buried in a ditch wondering what had happened when they'd just reached the limits of the bike's mechanical grip. Tyres just weren't as sticky in the 70s and 80s. So, I hope this journey through time has sparked some memories for you, just as it has for me. Revisiting the bikes that have left an indelible mark on my own brain has been an interesting journey. I understand that I may well have missed a few, and I would love to hear about your experiences. What are the motorcycles that have earned a place in your personal list of the most lethal bikes in history? These bikes were all from a time when raw engine power was the focus of the manufacturers of the world. That power outstripped the capabilities of the suspension, chassis and tyre technology, which just hadn't caught up. Tell me about your experiences with newer bikes too, because in another chapter we can dive into the modern era of motorcycles, where technology's caught up and every aspect of the machine is optimised for maximum thrills and excitement. So hold on tight, there will be more two-wheeled videos posted soon. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell button to make sure you see the next video too. Ride free everyone!